This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We want to welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And once again, we are your hosts. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in beautiful London, Ontario, the Forest City.
The Forest City, gorgeous and hot today in this September day. I'm Kevin George. I'm Dean at St. Paul's Cathedral and excited to be with you from downtown London today. The home of the traffic cone.
There's more orange downtown than I've ever seen in my life and across the city. It's crazy. Well, we're glad to be back. This is our second episode of our 11th season of the Vicar's Crossing, and today we're excited to welcome back. Always nice to have a return guest.
Yes.
Danielle Tumminio-Hansen is joining us once again, Kevin. So we're thrilled to have Danielle coming in here in a minute. So by way of introduction, Danielle is professor of practical theology and spiritual care at Emory's Candler School of Theology, where she researches at the intersection of trauma and theology, narrative, and philosophy. And she's got a new book that just came out in the middle of August. It's called Trauma-Informed Spiritual Care, Interventions for Safety, Meaning, Reconnection, and Justice. Right up our alley as spiritual caregivers and clergy. So if that is in your kind of wheelhouse, folks, then you'll want to hear about this today. So we're going to talk about that. And she's coming to London in a couple of weeks. So we'll chat a bit about why Danielle's going to be here and what's going on and how you can participate.
Yeah, awesome. And before we do all that, obviously, we want to begin as we always do. And interestingly, at our clericus the other day, we were talking about this whole practice of land acknowledgements and how we engage that and how sometimes we can feel like we're just doing rote by saying these things. But as we were reminded from the Reverend Hannah Scorer, who's at Oneida nearby, one of our nearby Indigenous communities, that just like our rote prayer books, sometimes it is important for us to continue to hold up this and put it before ourselves and ask the questions, not just about what we say, but what we do. And so we want to certainly acknowledge that the podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. These are lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we wish to do the hard work of building relationship and walking the two-row path together in reconciliation.
Taking a moment, too, to thank our sponsors here in the Vicar's Crossing podcast. We really do appreciate their support over the years and on for another year with us. So that's great. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And again, our thanks to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George today.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. And you know what? I was just texting with this guy. Bishop Todd Townsend, the Diocese of Huron. The Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And our thanks go to that Bishop Todd Townsend for his ongoing support of this ministry.
Very good. Thank you. And of course, to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Tricia Listar is our sponsor with Molly Maid. So Tricia, thanks so much for being a part of it.
Awesome. Well, Rob, we got lots to talk about today. Let's see if we can get Danielle.
We do. I believe she's here. And Danielle's back with us again on the Vicar's Crossing podcast. Welcome back. It's always great to have a return guest. It means Kevin and I can say, okay, we're obviously doing something well because people are coming back a second time. So welcome back. And how are you? We're so thrilled to have you aboard again.
I'm great. I love being with you guys. So thanks for welcoming me back again.
I think it's a bit of a stretch to say we were doing anything well. I mean, I just think that it means we haven't pissed her off like we have
Yeah, that's
everybody
right.
else. We're very good at that. Rob and I have a good track record of doing that. So
I find that hard to believe.
anyway, look, we're just glad you're here, and great news in that you're actually physically going to be here on October 5th here in London, Ontario, and we're super thrilled about that. Just for our listeners who may be anywhere within striking distance of London here, Saturday, October 5th at 7 p.m. here at St. Paul's Cathedral in downtown London, we'll host an event called Speaking of Rape, which takes the title right from Danielle's last book. She'll be our keynote speaker. It is brought together by the Faculty of Theology at Huron College, the Deanery of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Vicar's Crossing as well as with support from Inova Services and the London Abused Women's Centre. This is a follow-up event after you were on our podcast last season to talk about your book, Speaking of Rape, and we believe it's an opportunity for the community as a whole to learn more about a need to find the language to speak about rape and intimate partner violence. Here in London, we've this year alone experienced 2 or 3 very tragic deaths due to intimate partner violence and the ongoing issues that surround that. So it's an important conversation. So Danielle, just to ask, you're coming here. I think this will be your first trip to London. What are your hopes for the event? And if someone's out there thinking about coming but feeling a little reticent because of the fact that there's all the shame and everything that goes with the language around this, what are your hopes and what can you say to encourage those who really might need to be here that night?
Well, I've never been to London, and so one of my hopes is to get to know your community and the folks who are part of it. Kevin, you've told me a lot about London and the people that you serve, and so I'm really looking forward just to making some connections and having conversations with members of your community about a topic that's really important for all of us. I think that anytime we're asked to do something vulnerable or uncomfortable, it makes us question whether we want to make the effort. I know I felt that in my own life sometimes, and I think that there's a difference between pressing into some discomfort or some shame and experiencing something that's going to be re-traumatizing. So what I want to say is that anyone who's thinking of coming, for whom this is a personal issue or a really tender issue, if this seems like something that would be re-triggering, then re-triggering or re-traumatizing, then pay attention to that. But as someone who survived harm myself, I try really hard to present material in a gentle way and an open and compassionate way, in a way that that creates connections and makes people feel less vulnerable and less shame. And so my hope is that folks would come out to have that experience and and to feel that solidarity.
Yeah, and what Rob and I can say is too, to read the book, from which a lot of this comes, that you really do present the material in an incredibly sensitive and honorable way, especially given the personal nature of your own story and the fact that you present it the way you do. So encourage those who are listening to come out that evening. And if you're in London on Sunday morning, this big old cathedral has a few empty seats. Believe it or not, we're not packed on Sunday. But with Danielle coming, who knows? This could be the Sunday. This could be the Sunday.
The one. Yeah.
October 6th, we're going to have 600 people in the place. I feel it. Oh, Jesus, fill the building. And so we'll see what happens. But come and join us. So I'm very excited for that. So keep that on your calendars, folks. Now let's move forward to talking about your latest work. Thank you for sending us the book again. Not at all surprised to know that this is an incredible book. This is the 3rd one of yours I've read, and every one of them has been informative. I've learned so much. And it's not unrelated, this book, to your last work, Speaking of Rape, because it's about trauma. It's called Trauma-Informed Spiritual Care. Now, perhaps the best place is, you point out in the book that a study conducted in 24 countries found that over 70% of adults had experienced at least one event that the psychological community considers a likely precursor to developing post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think a healthy place for us to begin is a conversation about what trauma is, because it's a word that gets bandied around a lot nowadays, but it really does mean something specific, and there's some things it specifically doesn't mean. So tell us what it is and why it's important, particularly for spiritual caregivers, to know that distinction and why we need to respond.
Yeah, so I think that one of the common misconceptions about trauma is that we can easily define it or pull out a set of events that will necessarily traumatize someone. And one of the things that trauma theorists agree on is that there's a subjective element to trauma, that what might traumatize one person might not necessarily traumatize another person.
Mm.
And that has to do with um, a given person's neurological makeup, their prior exposure to a potentially traumatic event, um, their coping strategies, their cognitive abilities, all sorts of things, their support system. So, so what exactly is trauma then? How do we know what trauma is? And different experts have defined trauma in different ways. I think about trauma as having a component of being overwhelming for one's coping capacities. So the definition that I use in the book draws heavily upon that this is something that has overwhelmed a person's capacity to cope. And the result of that is significant distress. For some people, a trauma will result in post-traumatic stress disorder, but for a lot of people, it won't. Not everyone who experiences a traumatic event goes on to develop PTSD, but 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 anyone who does experience a trauma feels that it has overwhelmed their coping capacities in some way. And so that's a really key part of my definition.
So picking up on that a bit, Danielle, you're right that there are two different kinds of fallacies when it comes to trauma. Can you talk about those two for us?
Yeah, so there is an assumption that trauma is rare, and that's one of the fallacies that we have about trauma. And there's a psychiatrist named Judith Herman who wrote a book um, called Trauma and Recovery. And it's a book I draw on a lot. It's one of the most well-known and well-respected texts about trauma. And her major contribution, or one of her major contributions, is that trauma is not something that happens out there. It's something that happens in our community. It's not rare, it's pervasive. And that is an idea that emerged with a lot of her work, but her work was drawing upon studies about sexual violence from the 70s. So prior to that, people tended to think that trauma was something that happened uh, only in the military, only in war. And so when feminists, when feminists started looking at the sexual violence epidemic and seeing, sexual violence actually is happening in people's homes at a really high rate, then that was sort of the gateway to starting to realize that trauma is not a rare thing that happens out there in a war zone, but rather happens in our communities pretty regularly. And now studies have shown that it's not just sexual violence that makes trauma commonplace. There are all sorts of other events in our everyday lives that get processed as traumas. So the second fallacy is that all events are experienced the same way by all people. And the example that I've drawn on in my work when I try to explain this is that several years ago, I guess probably 7 years ago, my daughter and I were in a car and a deer jumped out of a ditch and collided with the car. And my 3-year-old daughter would say over the next few weeks, Mom hit the deer. And I would correct her and say, no, the deer hit the car.
Right.
And, and so, this is a really interesting question, right? Like, am I right because I was in the driver's seat? And I know that I swerved to the side, and I know that the deer jumped out, and at a very fast rate, but also, didn't move away from the car. It's like we locked eyes and that deer hit my car. Am I right because I was in the driver's seat and I saw? Or, and she's 3, so how
Mhm.
reliable of a narrator is
Yeah.
she? Or is she right because I've got a lot to lose by seeing myself as a deer killer?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
is the deer right? And we can't ask
Yeah.
the deer. So,
No,
but we can, you can see from the two of us, we experienced that
Yeah.
event
very differently.
differently.
Definitely, yeah.
And so we see this in people all the time that two people experience the same event differently. And that's because they come to events with different ways of processing them. And so the same goes for trauma. So the second point is that what might be processed as a trauma for one person might not be traumatic for another person.
Yeah,
It might be
yeah.
upsetting, but it might not overwhelm their coping capacities in the same way.
Right.
And so that just means that we have to have some degree of humility before we jump into some kind of, judgment or comparative suffering, and say, well, that couldn't have possibly bothered that person that much. It, it might not have bothered you that much, but
Mhm.
stepping into that person's shoes from their perspective, with their coping
Right.
capacities, their background,
Right.
their neurological makeup,
Yeah. Yeah.
might explain why it is for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an important thing for spiritual caregivers, as you point
Yeah.
out through the book. This is why I was so appreciative of it, because as a clergy person, like, and it's true, we're always told, and it's true, we're not therapists, we're not here to do that, but there are certain things that we can be aware of and certain tools that we can have to engage in these conversations to create some safety, and that's one of them for sure. And you also point out that as a spiritual caregiver, it's important to be aware of how trauma transmits horizontally as well. I found this very
Yes.
helpful. Can you help our listeners understand, what is horizontal transmission of
Mhm.
trauma really, and talk about, the reasons why it's important to know how that trauma is transmitted that way?
Sure. So I think of trauma as having two directions, and the first is horizontal and the second is vertical.
Mhm.
So the vertical dimension of trauma means that trauma transmits over time. So we know now that trauma can transmit intergenerationally,
Generationally.
Mhm. Mhm.
and we see this in the descendants of Holocaust survivors, the descendants of slaves, that the trauma of their parents and grandparents can be passed down to them, even though they didn't directly experience the event. And then trauma can transmit horizontally across a community. So, we often believe that the only people who could be traumatized by an event are people who directly experience it. But that's not by any means the case. People can experience what's called secondary trauma, which means they didn't directly experience the trauma, but they're having the same kinds of symptoms that we associate with a response to a traumatic event. And so those people could be the spouse and family members of the person directly affected. They could be first responders who were called in to assist with the trauma. They could be, uh, um, members of a spiritual congregation. Anyone who's kind of indirectly associated with the event.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think about here in Canada, we learned so much about that with the residential school
Generational
situation.
trauma.
And yeah, that generational trauma of people now whose parents, grandparents, even great grandparents were taken from their homes, and they're 2 or 3 generations removed, but still that trauma is very real in their
Huge, right?
families.
And that's a
Yes.
lot of what we're unpacking in the church
Yep.
in terms of relationships. The other interesting part that I was reading about was I really appreciated how you mined down on the experience of children, going back to the description you gave of your 3-year-old, right? But a child who experiences trauma may present symptoms that are somewhat different than what we see in adults, right? But the reality of childhood trauma, you write, is no less ubiquitous. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which we'll take their word at it from Canada, but we'll say that's okay. That 2/3 of children will have experienced at least one potentially traumatic event by the age 16. Share a little bit about the attachment issues in particular that children face having gone through a traumatic experience, and also a little about the ways, the other interesting piece of that, it was how race can play a pretty important role in terms of whether it's recognized in a child or not, which I thought was quite interesting.
Sure. So, attachment theory emerged in the psychological community in the 1950s, and the psychologists who researched human attachment found that our earliest experiences with the caregiver influence how we attach not just to the caregiver, but how we practice attachments, how we practice kind of intimacy and relationships in general. So children who experience trauma can wind up struggling with attachment, especially if the caregiver was responsible for the trauma. And because of that, they may grow up with something that we call insecure attachment. And insecure attachment is a form of attachment that's considered to be unideal. It's not a particularly helpful way of being in the world. So they a subset of this of insecure attachment would be what's called anxious attachment. So someone who has an anxious attachment style may struggle with trusting people or developing relationships with them. Another kind of insecure attachment is called avoidant attachment. And someone who has an avoidant attachment style is likely to want to disconnect with other people rather than to feel comfortable being emotionally intimate with them because it doesn't feel safe. And then there's a third kind of insecure attachment that's called anxious avoidant or disorganized attachment. And that's when you see both those anxious tendencies and the avoidant tendencies side by side. So someone may initially seem like they feel comfortable trusting and then back off because it suddenly feels unsafe. And so there's this kind of back and forth that they do. So, all of this affects a child's ability to develop healthy relationships, to connect with people, to develop healthy self-esteem, to know what healthy families look like. And so that's just a really hard place for a child to be in, and they need support to navigate that. And to your question about race, this was one of the most surprising. It wasn't surprising. This was one of the most, I thought, important things to name in the book. That we all know that implicit bias affects how people evaluate others and how they interpret their behavior for better or for worse. And so implicit bias also plays a role in how children are evaluated by members of the psychological community. So there was a study that found that when counselors engaged with Black and Hispanic youth and were diagnosing them, they were much more likely to diagnose them with conduct disorder or oppositional disorder rather than post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the things that's maybe important to name here is that symptoms for psychological disorders overlap quite a bit. And I actually talked about this a fair bit in relation to PTSD in the last book I did, the Speaking of Rape book, that there's significant overlap between PTSD and anxiety and depression in terms of the symptoms they present. And so similarly for conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder in children, there's some overlap in symptoms. So if a counselor isn't coming in and asking explicitly about the presence of trauma in a child's life, or listens and discounts it, they could easily diagnose the child with the wrong disorder, which then affects the kind of care the child gets, because they're not looking at the source of what's causing the distress for the child.
Right.
And the last point is that when we think of conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, for better or for worse, it becomes a lot easier to say, oh, there's something wrong with that child's character.
Mm-hmm.
And we shouldn't say that, right?
Right.
As a child, as a theologian, I believe every human's created good. I believe we're all worthy of dignity, but that's part of the sinfulness of our reactions to those diagnoses. And
Right.
so it becomes a lot easier to say, well, that's a bad kid, as opposed to that's a traumatized kid.
Yes. Very
So
different.
Oh, yeah.
very, very different. And then that, can also then impact how the child sees themselves. So there are some real ramifications to that bias that are really troubling.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Want to chat about vicarious trauma. Mention
Hmm.
that, talk about it. So you write in the book, this is a quote from the book. This occurs when a person hears about someone else's trauma but does not directly experience it. It is also commonly known as compassion fatigue.
Hmm.
Secondary trauma can lead to symptoms like those seen in PTSD, as you're speaking of, including anxiety and isolation, sleep problems, and emotional exhaustion, confusion. And it's considered an occupational hazard, certainly for those in helping professionals, including spiritual caregivers who work with traumatized populations.
Hmm.
And left untreated, secondary trauma can cause cognitive, emotional, physical, psychological distress. It may also contribute to someone leaving their profession for a
Mm-hmm.
different line of work. We've seen that time and time again in so many
Hmm.
occupations because they don't want to be exposed to that, right? So this, of course, can be a real concern for spiritual caregivers who often hear these stories and carry the weight of them. And you point out that there are some ways that spiritual caregivers can support themselves prior to and then during an episode of secondary trauma. Can you share
Hmm.
some of those with our listeners?
Yeah. So I think there are a number of resources that can be helpful. So the first is, understanding what your own triggers are, and making sure that you have the support that you need for your own wellness. So, a therapist, a spiritual director, um, those, yeah, those external supports can be really helpful in processing those triggers, so that you know what kinds of strategies are useful when something does get triggered. Um, the other thing is I talk a lot about groundedness and self-reflexivity and self-differentiation. So understanding you are different from other people. It sounds obvious, but it's not always obvious,
Not
Yeah,
especially
always
oh, yeah.
obvious.
when you're experiencing vicarious trauma. It can be hard
Yeah,
to know where you end and another person begins.
right.
Um, and spiritual self-reflexivity, kind of understanding your own assumptions about the world, what you're bringing to the conversation, um, and being fluent in those skills of differentiating yourself um, and kind of knowing what's formed you, who you are, so that you're not projecting onto others. Those are some really, really important skills that you can have that can also buffer against vicarious trauma. Grounding practices are worth their weight in gold. So deep breathing, contemplative prayer. I was just talking with some students today about swimming. Like
Mm.
I'm not a great swimmer, but I find swimming to be really helpful when I start to feel overwhelmed. It's something
Mm-hmm.
that regulates your breathing, that you're moving. It's actually pretty meditative, 'cause you're just going back and
Yeah.
forth. So whatever it is for you that provides that groundedness. A lot of people find yoga really grounding. Um, uh, I recommend doing. Um, and and then also seeking out the support that you need, and finally understanding what the symptoms of vicarious trauma are, so that you
Mm.
don't overlook them. And they look quite a bit like post-traumatic stress symptoms. So hypervigilance, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, having irrational outbursts of anger, um, uh, being hypervigilant, feeling depressed or anxious, having flashbacks, avoiding um, locations or reminders of the event. All of those are symptoms of trauma that can present if you're experiencing vicarious trauma.
I have to say, there's something delicious about uh, a grounding exercise being swimming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there's no quieter
grounded
place.
when
Yeah,
you're
there's
in
no
the
quieter
water?
place in the
Yeah,
world
that's
than the bottom of a pool. Like you want
it's
quiet.
true.
Well,
Yeah.
that's sort of how I swim too, Rob,
Yeah,
is
that
at the
just straight
bottom of a
down.
pool. Interesting. Rob and I are Seinfeld nuts,
Uh-huh.
and we
Yeah.
both read Michael Richards' book over the summer, and he actually, in a way, this relates because he writes about the trauma that he experienced as a child and as a young man, and one of the things he would do is the place he would go to for solitude was the bottom of the pool.
Bottom of the pool. Yeah.
He'd weight himself and he'd go sit at the bottom of the pool where everything else was shut out.
Oh.
So that was really sort of quite interesting. And he would find through his career, and we all know that things blew up for him with his racial tirade on stage and so on. But when you read the book, you come to realize that a lot of that comes out of an inability to deal with some earlier issues of trauma in his own life. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, but I'm going to ground myself. I'm going to jump in the ocean. And by the way,
very ironic.
by the way, when I swim, it looks a lot more like being at the bottom of the pool. It's not a good look. Anyway, look, you mentioned Judith Herman earlier and her work, and you do draw upon it a lot in the book. She pressed a 3-stage treatment model, and I thought we'd work through those a little bit one at a time here. So I'll ask you first about the traumatized person you say needs to rediscover a sense of safety. And then so looking at that safety, can we talk a little bit about what that is and what safety looks like in someone who's dealing with trauma or post-traumatic stress, reasserting a safe place?
Sure. So I really support a very holistic view of safety. So we often think of safety as being physical, right? That you have a door you can lock, that you have enough food to eat. But safety encompasses, every facet of who we are. So um, to really have a base level of safety, you need safety across several domains. You need physical safety. So you do need food, you need shelter, you need heat in your house or air conditioning in your house, whatever your climate is.
Wherever hot it is, yeah.
Yeah. And you need to know that your dwelling is secure. You also need psychological safety, and that means that you feel kind of psychologically comfortable in your community, in the group of people you associate as where you can belong. Cognitive safety and spiritual safety. So unsurprisingly, I spent some time with that spiritual safety piece. And that spiritual safety piece means that you feel comfortable getting angry at God, that you feel comfortable not believing in God, that you feel comfortable naming what you're spiritually experiencing, that doesn't feel dangerous, that your spiritual community, if you are part of one, is a safe place, right? So, we have a lot of examples of faith communities that have inflicted trauma. And so if your faith community is one of those, like that's not it's probably not a place you're going to find spiritual safety. So so kind of, leaving that community, finding a new community, whatever that means for the person to feel that they are in an environment that's spiritually safe, that they're if you're part of a faith community, that the people leading it are healthy and good, people you trust. All of that is part of that spiritual safety dimension.
Meaning making is
Oh,
another
wait,
one.
can I say one more
Yep.
thing
Oh,
about
yeah,
safety?
go ahead.
You're in charge. You're in charge.
Absolutely.
I think we often downplay the safety part of healing from trauma. And one of the things Judith Herman really wants people to understand is you can't get very far in healing without that safety piece. So, it's a bit like learning a musical instrument. I just started playing the harp, and so I'm
Oh,
like learning a musical instrument from scratch. And my teacher keeps telling me like we've got to get the technique down before we do anything else. And so we're going to spend a lot of time kind of drilling down the technique at the start so you don't learn bad habits. And I think safety functions like that in trauma. If you don't have that base level of safety, it's very hard to do the meaning making work and the reconnection work that are the second two stages of healing. So, it can be tempting to kind of gloss over that or move past it quickly, like, okay, I've got a house to live in, like I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But taking a good hard look at safety from all of these dimensions is really essential
Okay.
to, yeah.
yeah, Rob, before you go on, I got to ask
Yep.
two things just popped out about that. One of them is you're not really starting an instrument from scratch. If I remember right, you're a singer.
Yeah.
You've been in orchestras and all that. If I tried to play the harp, that will be starting from scratch. Okay, so just to be clear. But
Well,
on a more serious note, though, here at St. Paul's, we're in the heart of downtown London, so we're dealing with the most incredible vulnerabilities here around the unhoused population, a lot of issues around addictions, around mental health crises. And one of the things that the studies show us, and I've been working with the staff here around this, is to teach them that the people we're dealing with, more often than not, over 88% of them, as studies tell us, are traumatized individuals, right? Which is what makes this important, this work that you're doing so important for what we're doing here. And a lot of it starts with this thing that you're talking about, right? So we hear a lot of griping here from the conservative right politically about, well, they just need to get off of the drugs or they just need to do this but a lot of it is, there's no place to close a door and put your belongings and feel like you're not going to be robbed or attacked at night because
Yep.
you're not safe. And so there's just this trauma just keeps washing, right? So when we experience them in the fellowship center and we see some behavioral problems at time to time, I'm trying to say to my staff here, understand what you're getting, right? Like this is not, and again, this goes a little bit to what we're talking about the kids. Don't generalize and suggest these are bad people with bad behavior. There's a lot more going on.
Right.
And the
Yes.
safety piece of it is such a large part of what we're dealing with on a daily basis here with our vulnerable population.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Thank you for
yeah,
sharing that.
no, that's great. So safety, and then meaning making was the other part that you talk about too. And you're right, a lot about that in the book. And as spiritual caregivers, we have an important role at this as part of recovery in that too, because oftentimes we're, as you say, equipped to delve into struggles related to care seekers' spiritual lives and finding meaning like that. And we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out meaning on a deeper level. So can you talk a little bit more about how meaning making is so important in this recovery
Yeah.
too?
Yeah. So one of the things that people who experience trauma find is that their meaning making capacities are overwhelmed and the assumptions they had about their life and their world have just been upended. So to kind of recover from trauma, they need to resolve that distress and find a way to integrate that traumatic event into into their lives. So, another thing that people say when they are traumatized is that they kind of feel like time has stopped, that they kind of live in this traumatized space. It's hard to move beyond it. It's hard to imagine a future where they won't feel like they're traumatized. And that's all part of that, the brain trying to make sense of something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So there was a psychologist who did some great work on this who talks about um, why that meaning making distress occurs, and she describes the idea that when we make meaning out of particular events, but then we also have kind of global systems of meaning or big picture things that we believe. So those encompass kind of our big picture spiritual beliefs about God, or our overarching beliefs that about human beings. Like I said earlier, I believe that all human beings are created good. The creation is good. That's part of my global system of meaning. So when you have an event, a situation any situation, it can, you're going to make a meaning out of that situation, and then you're going to kind of reflect it up against this global system of meaning.
Right.
And most of the time, it meshes well with that global system of meaning, or, it doesn't quite a lot, but it's not a big deal.
Mhm.
Um, but uh, but then in a traumatic event, you have a situation that really seriously cracks cracks a hole in this global system of meaning.
Mhm.
And the assumptions you had about how the world functions globally cannot be reconciled with what you experienced in the traumatic situation. So the person then has to resolve this distress, has to try to make sense of of what's right and what's wrong here. Did they assess the situation wrong? Did they assess their global meaning making system wrong? Is there a way to resolve this? And so that meaning making stage really involves that conversation between the global system of meaning and the meaning that the person imparted to the situation until they can find a way to allow those to live together.
Right.
And it might mean modifying the global system of meaning or modifying their understanding of the event.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
spiritual care providers can do a ton of really helpful work here. And a lot of spiritual care um, leaders come into their work because that meaning making piece is
Right.
important to them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so the big caveat I give is that it's not your job to do the meaning making work. It's actually the person's job. But what you don't want to do is come in and say, well, here's what the meaning was. I will
Yes.
tell you, and
Yeah.
now we're
Yeah. Don't
done.
tell
It's
them the
like so
meaning. Yeah.
easy. Because
I've met
that's
those people.
yeah, that's it's the person's work to do. It's not your work to do. But what you can do is ask questions and listen and reflect back in ways that allow that person to do that work constructively. And spiritual care providers are open to conversations about God, about the purpose of life, about the meaning of biblical texts, things that have a very spiritual orientation that the person may be finding is contributing to the distress.
Right.
So, being able to engage with those questions helps the person resolve that conflict between the global and the situational. And using all those excellent pastoral care skills, is going to help too.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's in many ways we do it all the time with just like Bible studies, right?
Yeah.
When you're sitting around trying to create meaning with folks and you're asking questions of them to say, like, what do you hear? Right?
Hmm.
What are you envisioning? What's it saying?
Mm.
Yeah.
That same kind of work
Good,
is all about meaning making. Yeah.
good
Hmm.
theological reflection, right? A good
Yeah.
theological
Yes.
reflection. Yeah. So we've got safety and we've got the meaning making, and then Herman says it's Herman, right? Judith Herman,
Hmm.
and then the third one that she presses and that you pick up on is reconnection. And you write about how trauma disconnects people, right, from the world
Hmm.
around them. The work of healing trauma is often about bringing those things back, reconnecting people. You quote psychiatrist Herman again, pardon me, who said that if the core elements of trauma are helplessness and isolation, then reconnection counters both of those with empowerment and renewed relationships. So
Hmm.
you say that physical, psychological, and spiritual empowerment can be core elements of this process. Seems to us that the church can be a catalyst to support this critical work of reconnection, and thinking specifically about how we as the church can create loving, supportive, forgiving communities, as well as how we might offer the spiritual gifts of prayer, liturgy, the sacraments. Many churches are involved in justice-related causes that might be helpful for those who've encountered a trauma. Just again, an activism piece, right, can be a part of that. Rob
Hmm.
speaks of a parishioner of his actually who was abused in her marriage and later volunteered with the abused women, and she openly
Hmm.
spoke about how that healing, how that affected her healing. So, can you see ways in which the church can be more mindful of how to engage in that reconnection?
Well, I think you just named a lot of many of
Yeah.
the core things I would have said. So, our churches are increasingly countercultural if for no other reason than that we don't gather together, and we certainly don't gather together and sing anymore.
Right.
So,
We hardly gather
um,
around a table anymore,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So,
right?
the idea that this community comes together um, is in and of itself a way for someone to reconnect. So, Judith Herman talks about reconnection involving reconnecting with yourself. So coming to know who you are after the traumatic event and then reconnecting with your community. And that community piece, the church can do so much here. Like you said, rituals um, are something that the church uniquely contributes, liturgies. Um, Social justice activism is something that is often a way that people who survive traumatic events reconnect by doing that justice work, and the church is well situated to do that. And then the gathering piece. So all of that is a tremendous resource for
Yeah,
people.
great opportunity for sure.
Mhm.
So obviously we've talked a lot today about trauma itself and victims of trauma, as we should.
Mhm.
But in your book, you also write about those that cause trauma, like the offenders,
Mhm.
right? So just as a final question, just to look at that a little bit, you dedicate one of your chapters on restorative justice. It's well known that offenders in our system, in our context, get punished when found guilty of abuse and other things, and that oftentimes includes incarceration. However, you
Mhm.
point out that that isn't effective. Research shows that punitive philosophy that grounds the criminal justice system is ineffective, especially in comparison to restorative justice.
Mhm.
So, can you talk a little bit about what you found in your research? Firstly, a bit about what do we mean when we say restorative justice, and how are these elements of restorative justice may be a better way forward than incarceration and some of the other alternatives we have?
Sure. So, at least in the United States, our default is to incarcerate people when they
Jail.
do something wrong,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
we send a lot of people to jail here, and to prison. And there's a scholar named Danielle Tumminio-Hansen who's written a book about restorative justice, and she said, if retributive justice worked, if the criminal justice system
Yeah.
worked, the United States should be hands down the safest country in the
Safest. Yeah.
world,
Yeah, you'd
based
think.
solely on how many people we incarcerate. And we all know that that's not the case.
Yeah.
It's far from the safest country in the world. So, it doesn't take a giant social science study to show that there are serious flaws, at least in our criminal justice system. I do believe that there's a place for prisons in justice.
Mhm.
And I think that place for prisons is for two things. One is for the safety of individuals who've been affected by harm. I do believe there are people who need a big timeout and who need to be set apart for reasons of safety. And the other reason is that there are individuals who are not able to participate in restorative
Mhm.
justice processes because they're not open to it, or because
Mhm.
they don't see that they've done anything wrong.
Mhm.
And and in that case, restorative justice is not going to be the right fit for
Mhm.
making things right. Um, and so there are very good reasons to keep a criminal justice system, but it also needs to be a functional one that aims towards rehabilitation, and that's incarcerating people for the right reasons
Mhm.
and not for the wrong ones. So, restorative justice is an alternative form of justice that can be used alongside the criminal justice system or separately. And the main difference between the two is that retributive justice um, is punitive. It seeks to punish people. That's its default. And restorative justice seeks to make things right for the person who was harmed.
Mhm.
So what gets done looks very different, um, and can be quite varied. So, someone might feel like they want an apology. Another person might feel like part of making things right involves the person going to prison. Um, Another person might feel like they want an explanation, or they want, they want money to make up for money that was stolen or damage that was done. So the outcome can look quite different between people. But what restorative justice involves, first and foremost is a desire to make things right for the people that were harmed. And to do that, the people who are harmed need to be able to speak and share their story, and often to engage with their wider community and the person who caused them harm. So when restorative justice is done, it requires a facilitator, and that facilitator uses many of the same skills that a pastoral care provider has: active listening, asking open-ended questions, but they do a ton of preparatory work before the harmed party and the person who enacted the wrong or the wider community come together. And a lot of that preparatory work is to establish whether this is going to be a good idea, whether it's going to do what it hopes to do. But data shows that when that preparatory work is done well, and when people are capable of engaging fully, restorative justice procedures wind up having lower recidivism rates, meaning a person is less likely to reoffend than the criminal justice system. So I'm a big fan of, we need to do what works, and studies are showing this works better. I remember being a TA for a course in grad school on restorative justice, and someone said, "Doesn't this just let the offender off?" And another student who's a law student said, "I believe we shouldn't be looking at time served as being the easiest way to make amends. Saying I'm sorry can be way harder than sitting in a prison cell for 10 years and never having to take accountability." So, so the idea that just because you're not punished, you're off the hook. This is not a scenario where you're off the hook. The person who perpetrated the harm has to do some very deep introspective work.
It's I'm sure it's the same on the other side of the border with the First Peoples over there as they are here, but it's the healing circle in many ways. I mean, it's like for a lot of First Nations here in Canada who are not just doing some of their own policing, but are doing their own justice work. In some cases, this is the very model that you're talking about. I mean,
it is. Yeah. And one of the mistakes that we have about restorative justice is that it's a Christian practice, that it came out of Christian communities. And Howard Zare, who is a Christian, who's often seen as kind of the founder of restorative justice, he's been very clear about saying, I want to be transparent that restorative justice really emerged from Indigenous communities. And and I know Canada has done a lot in investing in and practicing that restorative justice work.
The other thing that you said early on in that answer was that, if it was just purely based on the number of people jailed, it'd be the safest nation. But as you said, it's not the safest nation. And as we learned this week, it's particularly not safe if you're a cat or a dog. If you're a cat or a dog in Springfield, it's not a safe place.
You don't want to go.
God help you people. I'm praying for you all. I got to tell you. But I don't know how it's close. That's all I'm going to say. I don't know how it's close. It shouldn't be close. Is all I'm going to say. I can't believe it.
Well, Danielle, thanks so much for being here again, and a great piece of work. And not only that, it's a great piece of work, but it's so practical and helpful for people that are in the line of work that we do. And I know others, this is something we got to have on our shelves, and to be able to look into and learn about some of those tools and consider things to do, as you say, is probably one of the most important things, which is create that space, right? For folks to be able to enter into holy and sacred space. So thank you. The book again is Trauma Informed Spiritual Care: Interventions for Safety, Meaning, Reconnection, and Justice. So Danielle, until we see you again in person in a few weeks, thanks for being here on the Vicar's Crossing.
Well, thank you again for having me. It was such a joy to chat with you today.
Great. And there goes Danielle. And again, she'll be here October 5th, 7 o'clock, St. Paul's Cathedral. We hope you can come and be part of that and meet her and be part of that forum. All right.
Awesome.
Very good. That's great, Kevin. Episode 2 is all done. It's season 11. We've got lots more coming up for you in the next few weeks, including a chat with our Bishop of Huron, Todd Townsend. Next week, right? We're sitting down with Todd next week. So that'll be great. All right. Thanks very much for dropping by, everybody. And thanks again to our sponsors, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex. both family-owned and operated, to the aforementioned Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve, and to Molly Maid. Remember, London, you can make your home a healthy haven. All you got to do is call Molly Maid, and all you got to do is call them today.
And it'll be clean.
All right. Good to be with you, my friend.
You
We
too,
will
buddy.
chat soon. And remember to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!